Welcome back, everyone. We had a wonderful beginning to the conference when we looked or listened to the complexity of the language that we use when we think about flourishing, happiness, well-being. And now we are going to shift gears to the people who have been driving the conversation in the last few decades, and those are psychologists. So, our chair of this session is Professor Steven Newberg. He's a foundation professor of psychology at ASU, and he's in the Department of Psychology, and previously also, I believe, the chair of the department. And he will introduce our speaker, Professor Corey Keyes of Emory University. All right, Professor Newberg.
All right. Thank you, Hava. I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Corey Keyes, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Emory University, where he held the Winship Distinguished Research Professorship. Corey's research has focused on the science of well-being, the intersections of mental health and mental illness, and languishing and flourishing, which he'll be discussing today. I won't dive into Corey's work because we'd all much rather hear from him rather than from me. I will note, though, that his work has been highly influential, not only inside the academy, and so for the scientist nerds among us, like me, his published work has been cited by other published work over 87,000 times. That's really impressive. But importantly, his work has been and is influential in the real world as well. Corey earned his PhD in sociology in the mid-1990s at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and soon thereafter moved to Emory University, where he was on the faculty until recently becoming Professor Emeritus. Corey's career accomplishments are impressive. Beyond his published empirical work, Corey organized the first summit on positive psychology, and early in the growth of positive psychology as a field, was lead editor, along with Jonathan Haidt, of an important volume on flourishing. He was a member of the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on successful midlife development. He participated in 2 National Academies of Science initiatives. He has consulted with government agencies and nonprofits around the world, and much more. His recent book, entitled Languishing: How to Feel Alive Again in a World That Wears Us Down, was published in 2024 and has been translated and published in 6 different languages, with 3 more on the way. So please join me in welcoming Corey Keyes, who will be speaking on the science of human flourishing, after which we'll have around 30 minutes for Q&A and discussion. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I was and still remain. Look, I was looking forward to this event greatly because any opportunity to talk about flourishing, as well as something as important to me, languishing, is a gift. But I will say I come to you with a bit of a heavy heart. And I multiple times almost thought I probably shouldn't do this because I've lost 3 loved ones in the last 4 months, and the most recent in beginning of January. And it's very difficult at this point in time. My heart is very heavy, but I think this will do me good. So thank you for having me. I want to begin with when I started my career, I started looking at public health documents around the world. And when I say what we want, I'm talking about when important governmental institutions try to introduce public health initiatives. They usually begin on the first page, or even in the preface, they say something like this that I don't think anyone here will disagree with. I think we all want these things. Health, to be healthy, and public health aims for good health for as many people as possible. But I thought there was always a disconnect between what public health wanted and what we say we want in our lives and what we do. We tend to focus on the leading causes of death. Now, that has proved to be rather effective. I'll give you that. And it shows up in the fact that we've increased life expectancy. We have a lot more on average life to live. And yet it hasn't, in many instances, created more health. We know that. Now, we're making progress when it comes to looking at illnesses such as heart disease If you study heart disease, you will know that we have made enormous progress in allowing people to live healthy lives, notwithstanding heart disease, as well as cancers. But that's not the case, I'm sad to say, when it comes to mental illness. Now, the National Institute of Mental Health also seeks, it says, to improve mental health by focusing on a variety of branches of science that are aimed at understanding mental disorders or mental illness. This is just one of a very recent set of studies that show whether we are or are not making progress. And I don't know if you know about the Global Burden of Disease study, but it was what in 1996 I thought would transform the landscape for those of us with mental illness. And I'm one. I suffer from PTSD, complex PTSD, and major depression. And it has motivated a lot of my research on trying to find a way out and to stay in recovery. You can read this. That was the quote I thought was rather depressing, to say the least, that the National Institute of Mental Health has been doing its business since 1949. The Global Burden of Disease started in 1996 and put depression on the map. At that time, it was number 4 among problems that public health considered in the top 10 list. And in many countries, depression is not just mental illness, it's depression. That's number 2, and in some cases, number 1, that leading the burden of disease. Now, I call that the wanting doing gap. When it comes to mental illness, we say we want mental health, but we focus primarily, if not exclusively, on mental illness. And you won't get any argument from me that I know the suffering it causes, and I have friends and family and colleagues, and you no doubt know someone in your life who, or maybe you personally have suffered from it. But our ancestors knew that we could not focus only on illness. Early in my career, I remember reading about the origins of medicine, and I was particularly fascinated by the story and the myth, the Greek myth of Asclepius. You no doubt know that. He was considered the father of medicine, and he had several daughters, 2 of whom represent distinct branches of what was supposed to be medicine or public health as we know it today, but both medicine and public health. We know Panacea very intimately. That was one of the daughters that focused on remedies for injury and illness. And I would say modern healthcare does a very good job with dealing with fixing, sometimes repairing, and often managing illness and injury. There was another daughter, hygiene, which in the ancient world referred to the presence and absence of health. And this snake that's on the staff represents, as I understand the myth, Hygeia, health, interesting enough. And we somehow, in the modern world, lost sight of Hygeia. And I would like to think that my work was trying to resurrect her when it came to our approach to mental health. The problem was when I started my career and I was in graduate school, I began reading the literature and could find no more of a description of health as more than the absence than this. I was reading a book published in 1941 by Henry Sigarist. You may know him. He was a noted medical historian. And as I turned to page 100, I was shocked to read this particular quote. Shocked for 2 reasons. But for the fact that it was so vague. And for those of you who know the World Health Organization, in 1948, it created a definition of health as more than the absence of disease and infirmity, but never spent any time moving in the direction of measuring health as more than the absence. And that's where I set my sights on trying to map out, if we were to move in this direction of the presence and absence of good mental health, what would it look like? And that's what my 2002 paper was all about. I presented this work at the first summit of positive psychology. It was published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior. And I want to say here that there is more and more work being done on flourishing, and we may want to have a discussion of this, but I use the word flourishing to stand in for the presence of good mental health. Technically speaking, I don't study flourishing per se as a construct. I meant it only as a stand-in for the word mental health. And the reason was at this time, I had lots of personal experience with trying to tell people that what I was studying was mental health. And the conclusions they would jump to was I was studying mental health problems or mental illness. When I used the word mental health, everyone jumped to the conclusion that I was studying mental illness or mental health problems. So it was clear to me then, and it is more so today, because a survey done by the Canadian Institute of Healthcare Research, I believe it was in 2009, if memory serves me. They asked a representative sample of Canadian adults, do the words mental illness and mental health refer to the same things or different things? In that survey, almost 6 out of 10, and rounding up from 56%, 60% of adults in Canada believe that mental health and mental illness are words that refer to about or near exactly the same things. Good news was 40%, but thought that, like me, they referred to distinctly different things. The other thing I do want to point out was, and I know I'm going to stay focused on flourishing, but what drew me to the work I do wasn't just flourishing. My starting point was really a form of suffering that I believed was being ignored by a world that only looked at the presence and absence of mental illness and treated those people who were free of mental illness as though they were an empty category, all mentally healthy. And that was what I came to call languishing, a word that I used to stand in for the placeholder for being mentally unhealthy. It was a place I knew as a young boy, and that's where I start my book, talking about what it was like after I had been adopted by my grandparents and removed from some very horrific situations. And all of a sudden, all of these negative things that I had experiencing for the first 11 years of my life were gone. And my life was transformed, actually. I was transplanted into a world where I had a safe home. I experienced love for the first time. I went from being in detention and doing poorly in school to an honor roll student. And yet, at the end of the day, while I didn't feel anything negative, I felt empty. And I felt this sense of emptiness as though I was a vessel searching for something to fill this. There was nothing good, despite the fact that I was suddenly experiencing all these good things in my life. Turns out when you experience a lot of trauma, it takes a long time to fill that void that has been hollowed out. But here are, and I'm not going to dig into any of the philosophical origins. I'm hoping my colleague Dan maybe provided you with some basis we can revisit this. But when I had to look for mental health, I went to the study of happiness, both in philosophical research as well as psychology, and even to my own discipline, which pioneered the study of quality of life studies. Long before positive psychology came along, sociologists were studying in large-scale surveys happiness and satisfaction with life in these large-scale surveys. So I began with a very long form called the Mental Health Continuum with over 40 items, and I've whittled it down now, and it's called the Mental Health Continuum short form. And there are 3 items that get at what we call hedonic well-being or emotional well-being. Do you feel happy, satisfied, or interested in life? Carol Riff pioneered the operationalization and empirical study of psychological well-being, but it's remarkable to think If you look at Marie Yehuda's book that was published, I believe it was 1952, but that book was commissioned by the task force that was responsible for creating the National Institute of Mental Health. And what Marie was doing was reviewing all the literature up to that point in time of psychologists who had bothered to talk about and conceptualize and think about the healthy personality. And she found these dimensions, and Carol Riff has operationalized these 6 dimensions that are a part of my mental health continuum. And I worked with Carol on this work as well. Do you like most parts of your personality? Are you accepting of yourself? Do you have warm, trusting relationships with other people? Are you being challenged to grow and become a better human being? Does your life have direction and meaning? Environmental mastery. Are you able to manage the responsibilities of your life? And autonomy. Are you confident to think and express your own ideas and opinions? I remember as a sociologist, when I was started to work with Carol Riff, I complained to her, I love the work you're doing, but you psychologists love the pronouns I and me. What about the pronouns we and us? Because those also are challenges we human beings face. And by the way, I think of psychological and what I will talk about next. These are challenges that human beings face to become good at functioning and doing well in life. We don't come into the world accepting ourselves, and nor throughout life are we very kind to ourselves. So it's a challenge to be accepting of who you are. Not all parts are good. It's a challenge to develop trusting, warm relationships. But human beings shift effortlessly throughout the day. One moment we'd be talking about me, and then the next moment I'm suddenly talking about we. And there are challenges that I found that in sociology, now, like psychology, sociology has been fixated on the negative. So when I look to the literature such as Durkheim, Marx, Max Weber, and I was very fond of Alfred Adler's work on social superiority and interest, what I tried to do was translate those dimensions into positive measurement. And these are the 5 dimensions that were part of my dissertation and what I called social well-being. Social acceptance. The challenge isn't that we just like ourselves. We're also challenged to live in a world where people are different. They think differently, they worship differently, they have different cultural traditions. And the challenge is, do we like other people for who they are? Are we accepting of them? Social integration. We're challenged to find a community where we have a sense of belonging, where we can derive comfort, even joy. Social contribution. Do you believe the things that you do on a daily basis or on a weekly basis contribute anything of worth and value to your community, to your institutions, even to your society? That's a challenge. Social coherence. We live in a complicated world, and human beings are meaning-making machines. And when we can't make sense of what's going on in the world around us, we struggle. So coherence is the ability to understand and make sense of what's going on in the world around you. And social growth, we're not just challenged to become better individuals. We are members, we're teammates, we're members of institutions, we're members of communities, and so forth. Are we being challenged to become better members? And if this is the one item in my survey where if I had to measure it again, I would ask people, are you good at or being challenged to get along better and cooperate better with other people? But social growth is the sense that we can become better members and work together. Now, I developed a diagnosis, and that is one of the reasons I left positive psychology. After the first summit, there was a big debate at Don Clifton Sr.'s home. And people worried that I was medicalizing positive psychology, and I'm a stubborn intellectual, and I had my reasons for going about it this way. But I also got a lot of criticism because I was not willing to separate the negative from the positive. I do this work not only because I wanted to make visible the invisible suffering of languishing, But I also believed we could do a better job in helping people recover from mental illness and preventing it. I turned the diagnosis of depression on its head, and we can talk about that in the Q&A and what that means. But there's 14 signs and symptoms of well-being in my mental health continuum short form. And when you combine the 6 psychological with the 5 social well-being, that's 11. You only need 6 out of the 11 every day or almost every day in the past month, or sometimes we measure it in the last 2 weeks. Combined with at least 1 out of the 3 feeling good. Again, every day or almost every day. So flourishing or good mental health is to feel good about a life in which you're able to function well. But I want to emphasize that mental health, as I view it, doesn't require people to be doing well on all 14 aspects of well-being. And that's important. It doesn't require us to have specific aspects of functioning well. Like you, I do love, and I write about this purpose in life, but not everybody is able or interested in pursuing and finding and searching for their purpose in life. We shouldn't problematize that because they should be able to choose any 6 or more of the functioning well and prioritize them. And if we want to help them, find those. And I like that. Flourishing is good enough mental health. You don't have to be doing well on all of them. And you don't have to have any one particular form of functioning well or feeling good to be considered flourishing. You get to choose. Now, I want to talk about how important these specific kinds of well-being are. And I write about this in my book. Now, there is this work that Stephen Cole and others have been doing called focusing on a specific set of genes that are responsible for what they call the conserved transcriptional response to adversity. Now, these genes have to do with inflammation and antibody production. What researchers have found that when we experience significant adversity, stress and adversity, those genes for inflammation tend to get upregulated, that is, turned on, and the antibody production tends to be downregulated. Now, the research I reviewed, and it was fascinating to look at, the CTRA, these genes and their regulation have nothing to do, there's no correlation whatsoever with the happiness and the feeling good, emotional well-being stuff. The most consistent correlation with flourishing has to do with the subset of items that are measured and that are called psychological well-being. Not social well-being, but specifically psychological well-being. When people have higher levels of psychological well-being, this response to adversity is dampened, which is a good thing. We want inflammation to be muted when we're experiencing adversities that have nothing to do with infectious diseases, but this response gets turned on even when we're not experiencing infectious diseases, when we're being stressed out. So the importance here is to find things that mute this response. And it's psychological well-being, not emotional well-being, that's specifically related to modulating the CTRA. Now, I was just reviewing some of this most fascinating work. A lot of neuroscientists in China, of all places, are doing some fascinating work looking at the neurobiology of the mental health continuum short form. And I'm going to just summarize very briefly the results here. And I won't do justice, but what they're finding is each form of well-being, emotional, psychological, social well-being, have specific hubs in the brain that are active, and when you have higher or lower levels. The emotional well-being, no surprise here, is activated with the brain structures and the dopamine system that have to do with reward and its regulation. Interestingly, psychological well-being, however, is associated with the brain structures that affect our ability to engage in what psychologists call executive function, that mental ability and skills that help us achieve specific goals in life. And research that's recently been published shows that social well-being has a slightly different hub. Among all is the left orbital frontal cortex, which has a lot to do with social behavior and our ability to engage in we rather than the me form of engaging with other people socially and deriving benefits from social contact. So people with higher social well-being have better activation in that particular part of the frontal cortex that enables them to engage in socio-emotional, intelligently social interactions. But that said, when you bring together these components into what I call the diagnosis of flourishing or good mental health or languishing, it has more to do with the efficiency of the system rather than the activation of these hubs. And the efficiency has to do with how the systems coordinate. And we can get into the weeds later if you have questions about this, but this is all to say that this questionnaire gets at the specific components that have to go deeply into our not only our biology, but how our brain is structured and how it coordinates between these specific hubs that have to do with executive function, social behavior, and reward regulation. That said, it's very clear that the research shows that the mental health continuum short form gets at a general overarching single factor. And when I was a graduate student, we didn't have bifactor exploratory structural equation modeling. And that's come along and has shown that my measure across various cultures fits a single overarching general factor, which they call well-being, I call mental health. I've done a good bit of research on the twins that are part of the Midlife in the United States study, and did that work with Kenneth Kendler. And what I found, and he and I found and published several papers together on the twins. And what we found was that the three types of well-being, emotional, psychological, social well-being, the best fitting model is that they come from a single source of additive genetic variance. They don't come from separate genetic sources. Again, the single behavioral genetic factor model suggests a general factor, not only at the phenotypic level, how we measure it, but at the genetic source level. But the mental health continuum goes even deeper. This two continuum model that was premised in the myth of Asclepius, as well as the World Health Organization's definition, is supported by the behavioral genetic research that Ken and I published. Now, this data, again, from the Midlife in the United States study, representative sample of adult twins. And the mental illnesses, we measure depression, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety. And mental health was measured by the long version of the mental health continuum. And by the way, the genetic model of the single factor model showed that mental health, as I measure it with my measure, is 72% heritable, just as heritable as mental disorders like depression. And it was the same model fit for males and females. It was gender equivalent. When we looked at how much of the genetic variance for mental illnesses in my measure of mental health shared in common or overlapped, it was less than half. 41% at the time. This was data from 1995. And I suspect if we followed this up and with the same twins who are now 20 to 30 years older, if they're still alive, that level would have declined. Nonetheless, what does this mean? We know that we inherit genetic risks for things like mental illness. We didn't know until the work Ken and I published that we also inherit genetic potential, good mental health at the same time. The fact that these genes do only overlap partially suggests that even though you have a high genetic risk for something like depression, doesn't mean that you didn't also inherit a very high genetic potential to flourish. By the same token, even if we could genotype your serotonin transporter gene, and it showed that you had the lowest risk, two short alleles. Just because you have the absence of genetic risk for things like depression doesn't mean that you didn't also inherit a low genetic potential to flourish. So the absence of genetic risk does not mean the presence of genetic potential for good mental health, and vice versa. In addition to the genetic research, I review in my book this affective neuroscience study that supports the dual continuum model, showing that that negative and positive emotions, the neural structures and activation do not overlap entirely. In the same way that genetic risks for mental illness and mental health are overlap only partially. And what this means is the absence of negative emotions does not mean the activation of positive emotions, and conversely. But it doesn't preclude the fact that people can feel both sad and happy, or positive and negative emotions at the same time. Now, maybe not as intensely, but I know that in my mourning, in my grief right now, I have very poignant moments that I would describe as bittersweet. Bittersweet feelings and emotions and in storylines are very poignant because the sadness is there because you've lost something very meaningful and worthy of feeling sad. And the happiness is because you're also recollecting all the love and the good moments that you shared, and the fact that you get to take those memories and carry their spirit with you. When I was teaching my seminar, when I had typically graduating seniors, and it was the spring semester, the semester they were about to graduate, my graduating seniors would describe and resonate with bittersweet moments. As they got closer to graduation, they felt poignant moments of sadness and happiness at the same time. And I said, please remember to welcome in the sadness because it's there for a good reason. You will be leaving behind. You're sad because you're leaving behind something that you invested in, meaningful connections to your institution, to your professors, to your friends. That sadness is there to remind you that you had invested something very meaningful that you will be leaving behind. You're glad and you're happy because you achieved something worthy of your sacrifice and hard work. So affective neuroscience also supports this. And there's two studies that, among more that are coming out, showing that even within person studies that look at, and these studies typically follow people for 14 to 21 consecutive days, and each day they randomly call them up or beep them, or they do experience sampling. And what they're feeling, whether they're feeling anxiety, distress, sadness, or feeling down, as well as their mental health, their well-being, their emotional, psychological, social well-being. That first study finds support for the dual continuum even within person in terms of those designs that within a typical day, the presence of the negative does not preclude the presence of also positive experiences and vice versa. And Mason Stevens is a young scholar in Australia that showed that the within-person study of negative and positive well-being was supported the two continuum model even in clinical populations. These are patients being treated for mental disorders. So there is very strong support for this dual continuum, and I want to end here by referring and going over just a few of the highlights of what the implications of that. There is now very, very strong support. And if you were to boil down my research to one conclusion, which was there is strong support for the two continuum model, what it means is even if we could cure all mental illness tomorrow, it would not necessarily mean that everybody is mentally healthy. And what I want to show you that if all we do is leave people languishing, we've simply moved people from one problem, that is mental illness, over to another problem, which is the absence of good mental health. Now here is data from a large study of US college students that I published, and this was a screening device called the Patient Health Questionnaire. And in the past 2 weeks, US college students would screen positive for depression or panic disorder or generalized anxiety, 13%, leaving 87%. Now, it's possible if we had screened for more mental disorders, that number on the end of any mental illness would have gone up to 15 to maybe 20%, leaving 80 to 87% without mental illness. This is the black and white world we still sort of live in. We are very concerned, for good reasons, with anyone who screens or has mental illness. But we leave as a blank slate the assumption that everyone free of it is somehow mentally healthy, which is not at all true because of the same data. When you map my diagnosis onto those young students, you'll find that 48% are free of any of those 3 mental disorders in the past 2 weeks and truly mentally healthy. 37% have moderate mental health, and 2% are free of any mental illness in the past 2 weeks and have what I would call severe languishing, And those with mental illness have some degree of languishing. And yes, it's true. And every so often you will find a few that are flourishing with a mental illness. But the point here is we can't accept this black and white world where we assume that 80 to 87% of the population free of any mental illness in the past 2 weeks, past month, or past year are somehow doing well. Because the second implication of this two continuum model is the following: anything less than flourishing results in problems. In other words, languishing is a serious issue that we need to pay much more attention to. Now, here are those students that, the students that are free of mental illness. And the percentage who in the past month engaged in either suicide attempts or some form of suicide ideation, serious plans or serious thoughts about ending their life, jumps from 1 to 4% if you're free of depression or panic disorder or generalized anxiety, if you're languishing mildly, moderately. It skyrockets to 15%. See, even without a mental illness, the absence of good mental health results in problems, but even with mental disorders, anything less than flourishing results in the elevation of problems. Now, the thing you will notice here is that level of good mental health matters greatly in determining, if you will, risk for suicidality. It's not just mental illness that's causing problems here. And I want to make this point as loud and as clear as possible. Up to this point, the world has been assuming that when people are mentally ill, it's only the mental illness that's causing risk for problems or actually causing problems with functioning. So if you're depressed, it's only the depression. But languishing is also there. Most people who have a mental illness are languishing to some degree, as we saw. Very few are flourishing. A lot are languishing mildly to moderately, and too many, but a number of people are languishing severely. And their level of languishing is also contributing to the problems that we misattribute to the mental illness. Now, there's a positive and a negative way to view this. The good news here is perhaps depression, I'm just going to focus on that, isn't as bad as we thought. It's not just depression causing the problem, it's languishing that's there with it. The bad news is we're not dealing with a problem that comes along with mental illness, and it's complicating, as I will talk about. It's complicating our ability to recover. I know this personally, and we published data on it as well. Before we get to that, the third implication is this, that any languishing or the absence of good mental health can be, in some cases, as bad as the presence of things like depression. Here's data from the Midlife in the United States study where I was able to look at whether they met the criteria for depression, languishing, or flourishing. And then we asked those adults who were working part or full-time, how many days they'd missed in the past month due to specific reasons. Physical reasons, that's not part of the analysis here. The days of work that were missed due to mental or emotional reasons. And I extrapolated that over 12 months to look at the number of days that adults who are working part or full-time missed in my sample. Then I was able to look at what percentage of the total days missed over a typical year were due to languishing or depression. As you can see, languishing is responsible for exactly the same amount of missed days of work as depression. If you were to look at the number or the mean days missed by people who are depressed compared to those who are languishing, I'm here to tell you, and I could show you the numbers. People who are depressed missed many more days of work than those who are languishing. But there are many more people and adults who are languishing, many more, often 3 to 4 times more adults as well as youth that are languishing compared to those who would meet the criteria for depression. So even though a languisher on average misses fewer days of work than those with depression, when you multiply those fewer missed days of work by the number of people who are languishing, that's the multiplicative effect. I could show you the same thing for work cutbacks, which are you showed up for work, but you were less productive or you left work early. In this case, languishing contributed to more work cutbacks, slightly more. But what's the bigger problem? We've been assuming it's depression. Depression is a big problem. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to misinterpret my data. It's very clear. But we're missing another equally big problem. It's not just the presence of depression, it's the absence of good mental health. Now, I could show you, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some slides, and I could show you when it comes to mortality. But I want to get to the fourth and the fifth implication. An absence of good health, what I call flourishing language, is as serious as illness. Now, I know this, for some of you, you know this virus very well as COVID-19. And it's not that long ago that we were experiencing the shutdown. And there was a study that came out, I forget, I think it was in 2022 or 23, where I read this conclusion. They were looking at data from the 2020, the first year of the pandemic, came to the conclusion that the pandemic alone created 53 million more cases of anxiety and 76 more million cases of depression worldwide. That's true with a major caveat. That wouldn't have happened if we had been mentally prepared and had more of the world population that was flourishing or mentally healthy. Two studies that came out during, but there's many more that preceded this, that showed that people who are flourishing, who experience adversity, but also those who were being studied during the pandemic, who were flourishing, were far less likely to develop anxiety disorders and major depression. If they were languishing, much more likely to develop anxiety and depression. And their level of languishing, as it became more severe, increased the risk. In other words, if more of the world's population had been mentally healthy, or what I call flourishing, COVID would not have produced nearly as much new cases of anxiety or depression. A study that came out in Italy, in the region of Lombardy, which was a very hard hit by COVID in the early period, was using my measure for frontline healthcare workers. And again, what they found was among nurses and doctors who were flourishing, they were far less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the work that they were doing in the front line during the very difficult early periods. If they were languishing, PTSD was much more likely. My point here is the absence of good mental health is a risk factor for when we experience adversity, and when we are mentally prepared, that is flourishing or mentally healthy, we are much more likely to be protected against the problems usually associated with things like COVID and other forms of adversity. I'm going to skip over this and, for the interest of time, jump to these studies. This was a study I found fascinating that I reviewed in my book, and it was a study of daily stress and negative mood. They followed these individuals for 21 days straight, and each day they measured whether they experienced any of these or more of kinds of stressors, interpersonal problems, conflict at home, financial issues, and so forth. And on that day, they also measured their negative mood, how depressed, anxious, or angry they felt. And what they found was that whether you were flourishing or languishing had nothing to do with whether you experienced more or less stressors. People, on average, experience stressors on 17 out of the 21 days that they were being studied. And it didn't matter if you were flourishing, you didn't have more days free of stressors than the people who were languishing. However, what they found was on those days, and that's most days, when bad things happen, people who are flourishing have a far lower level of negative mood than people who experience these stressors when they're languishing. If you're languishing, you're much more likely to have a much more negative mood at the end of the day as a resulting you experience the problems. If you're flourishing, you seem to be buffered. So flourishers don't have better days. It's just that when the bad things happen, it doesn't affect them nearly as much as those who are languishing. And I want to jump to this, the final conclusion with the time we have left before we open this up for some discussion. And this is an important implication of the two continuum model. The things that we have pioneered that we need to treat mental illness do a very good job in lowering the bad, helping us to alleviate symptoms of mental illness, but they do not necessarily promote good mental health. I didn't review this in my book, but I found these studies afterwards, and they're really important. These are two therapy modalities that are very effective at treating anxiety disorders and mood disorders. And both of these studies included my measure, the mental health continuum short form. And what they found was, and I'm going to summarize because both studies found nearly the same results. Typically, 70 to 75% of patients receiving either ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, or cognitive behavioral therapy benefit in having their symptoms of anxiety or depression lowered to the point where, if it's sustained, they would meet the criteria that psychiatrists have for being in recovery. However, only 20% of those patients also benefited in terms of having their mental health increased as measured by my mental health continuum. All of these patients were languishing to some degree. In other words, 50% or more of patients who benefit from typical therapies for mental illness have their symptoms lowered, but are left languishing. And the 20% or so that actually have their languishing addressed, we can't say that they're necessarily catapulted into flourishing. Now, why is this important? 3 studies have been published that show that even if you have recovered from mental illnesses like anxiety or depression, your level of languishing determines your risk of recurrence. Point here is that even if we care about and want to help people with mental illness and treat them, if all we do is leave them languishing, we may, without knowing it, be creating a revolving door for relapse and recurrence if we do not also address the need for promoting and helping people with mental illness move towards flourishing. The closer they get, the longer they stay in recovery. And I think that's a win-win. So I want to end here. I could show you a lot more data. The point here is my dream and vision here is that if we're going to take this notion of flourishing seriously, we also need to take on the unappreciated form of suffering that needs far more attention from those of you who care, which is languishing, the absence of mental health. It's a gateway for the onset of things like depression and anxiety. It's also a gateway for relapse and recurrence, among many other problems. My dream is that what we do is create a healthcare system that aims to protect against the loss of something as valuable as flourishing. If you have any assets that are worthy of protection, we would put that in the bank and protect it. I'm convinced that good mental health is as valuable and worthy of protection, so that we know people are going to have a difficult period time coming in the future. We want to do everything we can to protect against the loss of good mental health. And we want to engage in a healthcare system that actually monitors in an ongoing way the presence and absence of good mental health, so that we can respond to the earliest losses and engage what I would call restorative healthcare. In the same way we can keep old cars and antiques looking pristine, even though they have lost their luster and maybe aren't functioning, we can engage in restoration of well-being and flourishing. But we need to respond to the earliest losses. And the final vision I have is that we create a healthcare system that invests in preparedness in the same way that we now know we need to engage in preparedness for an increasingly unpredictable and climate that creates storms that are far more problematic. I believe flourishing is about mental preparedness. It prevents a lot of the things that we cannot cure. It allows us to face the fact that most days we will have problems. 17 out of the 21 days in that one study, but they don't have to destroy our mood and create a negative spiral. So I will leave it there and open it up for questions. And thank you for your attention. And I look forward to our conversation.
I think on behalf of all of us, I just want to tell you we're so sorry for your recent losses, and may their memories be for a blessing for you. So
Well, today was to honor them. That's why I did it,
okay.
and to honor you.
Right. Robert.
All right. So, Corey, I too, just want to tell you how thankful I am, not only that you gave this presentation, but that you gave it such a personal touch. But my question is this. I'm skeptical about, and really skeptical from a totally amateur standpoint,
Okay.
about the distinction between languishing and depression.
Yeah.
Because from what I understand as an outsider, depression itself is extremely hard. It's a bit of a fuzzy diagnosis. You've got 10 possible symptoms, and if you have 5 or 9 of them, and if you have 5 out of 9,
Yeah.
then you have depression. But as far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we don't really understand the mechanism all that well. And then we also have these drugs, the SSRIs that have worked for a lot of people, not everyone, and we don't even know how they work. And so what I'm just wondering is why you think languishing is really a different thing. Might it just be just a very mild form of depression? Because as long as we don't have a biochemical model
Yeah.
of how depression works, I don't see how you can easily differentiate between those things. Why one might not just be a variation on the other.
Well, in some of the studies, and in particular, I'll just look back at my 2002 paper. I looked at the mean number of symptoms of depression associated with the categorization that I used at that point in time for people who were languishing. And the average was 1.
Mhm.
Now, there was variation around that mean of 1 symptom of depression. But in that case, in the 2002 paper and in other papers, we can actually look at the degree to which some of the symptoms overlap. And there is, this is the same way we see things in cognitive psychology. I remember studying prototype theory. There's fuzzy boundaries between concepts. That's the nature of life. There is always going to be a slight bleeding of languishing into mental illness and a slight bleeding of some symptoms of mental illness over into languishing. But when you operationalize it, let's just look at the operationalization. Now, another way to think of languishing in its most pure form is it's the absence of both good and bad,
Mhm.
relatively speaking. Now, it's not to say that all people who are languishing have the complete absence of well-being, but typically they experience the signs, those 14 signs I talked about, rarely, if ever, in a typical month. And there's quite a few people who rarely, if ever, experience any of the 9 symptoms of depression as well. And so there is a kind of pure form of languishing. And when I was doing my book, I did a lot of interviews with people, and they too would talk about this. They don't feel sad. Now, there is a little bleeding over, especially in the loss of interest in life.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it really comes. That's what I would call the interesting magical gateway, Robert. Suddenly, when we've lost interest in life. So, but here's what people would use. They would talk about feeling like they're dying inside.
Mm.
Now, I don't, maybe there's some empirical research that does qualitative interviews with people like depression who are depressed. Now, with the caveat here, a lot of the work on depression will say that, wow, that's languishing sounds like depression. Well, remember, languishing is there with depression. So when sometimes people are talking about their depression, sometimes they're talking about their languishing. This sense of emptiness, this sense of feeling dead inside, this sense of feeling like you are a ghost or you're invisible.
Mm.
These things start to get at something that's quite different from, from depression. But the problem is that when we focus mostly on people who are depressed, and what we've not acknowledged is that languishing comes along.
Mm.
It opens the door. It doesn't stay at the door and say, here, go into the room where you can now experience depression. It comes along and it's there. And so that's two ways of sort of responding to it. It has some existential qualities that sort of differentiate it, but
Mm.
that the big overlap is interest in life.
Interesting.
Okay,
Corey,
let's
can
go
you
to
Thank you.
stop sharing?
Oh, of course. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. I forgot to
Now
press
we
that.
can see you.
There we go.
uh, Alan, but then after Alan, let's go to there's a question from Gedalit in the chat. So Alan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that excellent talk. I want to draw upon a comment that I believe Robert Eisen made in the previous talk, which
Okay.
I think is relevant, which he said, didn't you? I think you said this. We often don't really know what it is that what makes us happy or what ought to make us happy. We're often mistaken about that. I
Yeah.
think that's what you said, something like that. So I'll start with that observation. I believe that that is relevant to your talk we just heard. So so here's my concern.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm going to reference my friend Jonathan Rosen's recent excellent book called The Best Minds, in which he pointed out, I think he would disagree with you here. I think his claim would be that the medical profession, particularly the psychiatric profession, has not devoted enough energy and attention to those with serious mental illness. And that's why we have so many people with schizophrenia living on the streets. And so that the idea that we should be the limited mental health resources we have should be devoted to the 87% with mild unhappiness would be a mistake in his view. The second thing, which is related, that I think the argument might be, some people might claim, I'm not claiming it myself, but they might claim that what you're doing here is you're medicalizing what are essentially philosophical and spiritual issues that people have. And that the medical profession would not be the right, or the mental health professionals would not be the right people to address these issues. And there's a certain alarming quality to your comments that we should be constantly monitoring everyone's mental health. There's a certain, it's a little bit very worrisome. That's all I'll say. It's got a little bit of a big brother aspect to it. Let's just leave it at that. The final thing is here, when you talked about flourishing, you said flourishing is good enough. Not everyone is looking for a purpose in life. You get to choose. Okay, I think that's the key issue. You get to choose. So that made me think a little bit about Viktor Frankl's book, right? What is his book called? Search for Meaning. It was Man's Search for Meaning, right? But I think what Frankl found was that people who had believed that there was who believed in external standards, even transcendent external standards, were actually better able to weather just the sort of stresses in life that you correctly point to as leading to mental health issues. He said that what really works for people is not you getting to choose. No, he would disagree. You know, even though he didn't really draw out the implications of his finding, that would seem to claim that it's really important to have external standards that are impersonal, that we can live up to. That's
Yeah.
what we're missing in our culture. That's what I think that's the implication, the exact opposite of what you've said in your talk. So I wonder if you could address those.
Oh, I hope, no, I actually didn't make any point about these standards are there as in the secular sense, but they also bleed into spiritual and religious traditions. The sense of contribution, belonging, purpose, of course, all of those. My only point is this is that oftentimes people, when they finally start to understand this work, they think we're expecting too much of people. And my point in saying that there's enough and that there's choice is that not every point in trajectory of life are you able to deal with the sense of purpose. And I've seen this in my young people in the data in young adulthood, in adolescents and young adults. That that the research shows that searching for that purpose, where when you can actually act on it and you have not yet acquired the place in life and the standards and the skills to activate it, it actually leads to lower levels of well-being. So what I'm doing right now with a colleague in Quebec is studying, helping young people to think of the life they're leading now as making a plan for it and enabling them to engage in their purpose in life so that they see their educational sacrifice and then devotion is leading to the ability to finally, when they acquire the position in their institution as a doctor or as a lawyer, as a professor anywhere, that they can actually do that. So when you're young, I think we actually emphasize something that may not be possible for everyone to acquire. And it makes life seem harder for them because they struggle over this. And there's even such a thing that I write about called purpose anxiety, that I'm supposed to have it, but I can't find it. And yet I haven't acquired enough standing or position or an institutional placement to even do anything about what I care about. That's just one response. That's the only point I'm trying to make, is that what we have to be careful about saying that only a certain set of symptoms of well-being make up flourishing. I want flexibility across the lifespan for people in different positions and in different situations to actually realistically go after the things they need. Because of what I've found empirically, Alan, is that it doesn't matter what set of symptoms you have, as long as you have six and one or more of the other, but at least six of the good stuff combined with at least one of the feeling good. It doesn't require that. So I think my sense of that is not to say that choice is a bad thing. It's just necessary and flexible for a life that's constantly changing. And for young people who are looking to acquire the skill but aren't there, it's going to take a long time for them to get to the point where they can, through their work, say, actually deliver on the promise of purpose in life. But then again, not everyone actually finds it in work either, right? And so anyway, that's one response. When I was reading Frankl's work, my sense was that he talked about unfinished business, and that the need for love and unfinished business was one of the things that gave strength in the face of enormous suffering and adversity. And I think it doesn't matter what symptom of well-being that goes into flourishing. If you think you have things to contribute and you have unfinished business to things of worth and value to give, I suspect that would sustain a lot of people through the worst times. If you have been removed from your community, but have a strong sense of yearning to return and belong, I suspect, and I could go through each of the signs and symptoms of flourishing and suspect that to me, it's about the sense that my business here in this life is not finished. I have work yet to do, good work. When I read Frankl, that wasn't the only, but that's what I took away from that message. I still have love in this world and good works to give. And so I will work as hard as I can to make it, because there's unfinished business here. Well, and your first question, I get it. I faced that response and criticism a good bit of the time, and I agree. There is so much unmet need among the severely mentally ill. That's true of also of what we call people who have common mental disorders. There's a lot of unmet need. And yet, I think the two continuum model makes it very clear that even if we could meet all the need out there, and even, Alan, I wish I could wave a wand and cure all severe mental illness and all common mental illness. If all it did was cure the illness and left people languishing, I suspect we would be left with yet a new problem. And what we do is, when it comes to illness and well-being, is we live in a whack-a-mole world. As soon as we solve one problem, guess what? It comes up. COVID, where did that come from? Who knows? I mean, we could spend our whole life chasing death and illness and never get to the business of well-being in life.
Okay, so let me jump real quick. Lisa, you're sharing your screen right now, probably inadvertently, I suspect. So we have a question in the chat from Gedalit. What measurements do you use to define languishing with regards to inflammation in the brain, or is it a subjective, individualized measurement?
No, those studies that look at this, the CTRA, it's a long, actually use my measure, the mental health continuum short form, those 14 questions. And then they do blood assays and send it off to a lab and look at the genotype profile for those sets of genes and the degree to which they've been up and down regulated. Now, don't ask me. I have no idea how they quantify the degree of up and down regulation in genes, but I suspect if there's anyone here, they could actually inform us. But they can essentially correlate the level to which those genes are, the degree to which the inflammation genes are up regulated. And so think of it as it's kind of a negative correlation between my measure. Those people who are closer to flourishing have a more muted response when they're experiencing adversity. That means their genes are a lot is upregulated. And there's actually research that I didn't review, but it's in my book, that shows that people who have higher levels of psychological well-being have lower levels of white blood cell count and lower levels of C-reactive proteins, which are the biomarkers for inflammation. So we don't have to look at the genotype, we can just look at the biomarkers of inflammation. And they're negatively correlated with aspects of the mental health continuum. As well-being goes up, specifically psychological and social well-being, as they increase, CRP, C-reactive protein, and white blood cell count goes down. And that is one of many, if you will, associations between the measure and biological markers that are important for understanding things like early mortality. I skipped over the study that showed, and I published, showing that towards the end of life, languishing is a pretty significant risk factor for premature mortality. And one of the candidate explanations is inflammation, that it's activated and far more rampant in people who are languishing than those who are flourishing.
So I see we have a little break in the questions. I have one actually for you. And that has to do with the extent to which you view languishing and flourishing as domain general versus domain specific. So let me give you my context here. So I do research on different fundamental motivations, challenges that people face in life, right? Self-protection, disease avoidance, social affiliation, status seeking, finding mates, keeping mates, caring for caring for offspring and kin. And I'm wondering, and at different stages of our life, we focus more on some of these than others, or depending on circumstances like COVID, we might focus more on some than others. And I'm wondering whether, what your view is to the possibility that maybe we could be languishing, flourishing in sort of some domains and not other domains, either sort of depending, where we happen to be in life, but also maybe even for some of us dispositionally that there, and depending on therefore which domains of life or which challenges we're dealing with, we actually could be doing quite well, or as soon as we end up
Yeah.
shifting to this other domain, less well.
I love it, Steve. We have a paper. I have a paper in Revise and Submit for the Journal of Occupational Health, where I'm working with a colleague at University of Illinois School of Business, where we contextualized my 14 questions. We asked the 14 questions in a specific random order. First, at work. When you're at work, does your life have direction and meaning? But when you're not at work, when you're at home in your community, does your life have direction and meaning? So, each question was first asked either at home, in your community, or at work. And it's remarkable to see how contextualized languishing and flourishing is. Oh, I think if I memory again, we haven't published this paper, but it's under Revise and Submit, and we found that it's very rare for people to flourish at work. I think it was 9 to 10% at the most, flourish at work but languish when they're at home. It's far more common to languish at work than it is and people flourish at home. The good news is about a third are able to flourish at both. Bad news is almost another third languish in both places. But the predictors of when you're languishing at work are very specific to affecting your work, but don't necessarily spill over to home and vice versa. So you're spot on. It's as if we don't carry our mental health everywhere we go. We're not the same person. So at home, I'm able to flourish, and as soon as I leave home and I enter that workplace, I languish, which is a remarkable, I think, finding. And I'm so fascinated to do more work in this area. But we just finished collecting data last year and have our first paper under Revise and Submit, contextualizing languishing and flourishing.
It might be really interesting to take our sort of motive scale and your scale and put them together and sort of see what would happen with that.
Yeah.
All right, Hava, I see you're next in line. Hava, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah. I'm not a native English speaker, so I'm trying to figure out what exactly does the word languishing mean in my native language, which is Hebrew, and I'm having a hard time finding the analog here. So I looked you up on Google, and it turns out that in the way you define languishing, it has to do with self-esteem. So can you say more about what is the role of self-esteem to the story, and even forget about the analysis, all the quantitative analysis, but just I try to understand what is involved in languishing.
Well, a very close analog to self-esteem. It's a close cousin, is that psychological well-being dimension called self-acceptance. It's a part of languishing. But not necessarily for everyone's languishing. As I said, to flourish, you don't have to have higher levels on all 14 things that I measure. By de facto, you don't have to have low levels on all of those things necessarily to be languishing. But self-acceptance is a corollary, if not a very close cousin to self-esteem. What I like about self-acceptance, Hava, is that it seems to me more grounded in reality. Who here doesn't have the dark side as well as the light side? Who here has not done wrong as well as good? Who here is an angel some days, and who here is not always the angel they want to be? Who here isn't always the best version of themselves, and some days we are. The thing I like about self-acceptance being more of a part of languishing and its absence is that I think what happens is that when people can't find a way, or even they forget that there's some good parts of who they are or once were, and they come to dislike themselves so much that they would literally want to leave that person behind. Imagine that. Imagine that kind of life. To feel that you loathe yourself so much and see nothing good about yourself. Now, I've been in the rooms with addicts and alcoholics who are coming in. Oh my God, not only are they languishing, but they have a severe problem with self-acceptance. It's a horrible place. It's a horrible form of languishing because you don't want to be the person you've become. And people call sometimes this rock bottom. It's the place where either we die, we finish the job, or as I've seen in addicts, we turn our life around. Those moments. So I'm not saying that self-esteem isn't there. I just think the acceptance of yourself seems a more grounded, realistic version of what we human beings struggle with. We're not always angels. None of us are. We're not perfect. We struggle. And yet some people find a way to see more of the good than the bad in themselves, see more hope for improvement than decline. Languishing is just the opposite. Is that?
Okay, thank you.
What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, does help to clarify.
Thank you. Elliot?
Sorry. What I was thinking of is in terms of moral education, actually. If you want to create somebody who is flourishing, what should you say to parents? What should you say to teachers? What should you say to other people in people's lives, right? Well, let's start with parents. How do you augment a sense of flourishing? And then when you talk to teachers, how do what should they do to do that?
Thank you for that question, because I write about several studies that don't get a lot of attention and that have to do with the relationship teenagers have with adults in their lives, parents as well as adults outside of the home. And I don't want to, it's remarkable. One study of the many that I reviewed suggest we could solve the problem of teenage languishing if we focused more on encouraging the kinds of relationships I think teens are yearning for. Here's a study of over 37,000 teenagers between the ages of 11 and 13 across 26 countries. And they used my measure, but then they asked these teens these 5 questions. Are there people in your family who care about you? Will someone in your family help you if you have a problem? Third, do adults in your life listen to you and take your views into account? Fourth, do your parents consult with you when making decisions about your life or that affect you? And 5, do you feel safe at home? It was 84% of teens were flourishing if they had those 5 things in their lives with adults and at home. As those things were lost, if you didn't have any of those 5 things, only 16% of teenagers were flourishing. But let's go back to the fact, those 5 qualities of relationships, if we focused on them with our teenagers and adults in their lives at home, we would almost solve the problem of languishing in teens. 84% were flourishing if they had at least those 5 qualities. What do you think about that?
Love it. Thank you.
I do too. And here's the way I say I love and I appreciate Jonathan Haidt's work. And we're in an age where we think if we take social media out of the hands of teenagers, we will somehow solve the problem of languishing. We're ignoring the fact that they need relationships, real relationships with adults in their lives. Even though they might act like they don't, they say they want those 5 things. I'm all for controlling social media, but if all we do is get rid of that, not deal with the very things that I just talked about and you are referring to, Elliot, we're not going to solve the problem of languishing.
Right. As you're talking, I'm thinking of some of the people in my own life who provided those things.
Yes, those are our earth angels.
Yes.
I know them acutely as a kid who was abandoned. If I hadn't gotten those, Elliot, I would not be here.
Right.
I know I would not be here. You're right.
And the good news is that even though your parents failed you, there were others in your life that could fulfill those functions.
Yeah. One of the 3 people that I lost in the last 4 months was my dear professor that I write about in my book, who I've known since 1983 when he taught me theories of personality. We spent those years ever since 1983 almost like father and son.
Yeah.
Yep. When you can't find it at home, resilient children try to find it anywhere they can. And if adults care, oh my God, we light up.
Denzel Washington talks about the fact that his 7th grade coach was the one that functioned as his father image.
You're gonna make me cry, Elliot.
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, it's good tears. Those are more stories need to be told about those people
Right.
who lifted us up.
And with that, with lifting us up, we're at time. And so thank you so much. Join me in thanking Corey for a wonderful talk and a really interesting Q&A.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Keys. This was wonderful. We're going to take a break for lunch. I'm sure everybody could appreciate a good lunch. We are going to start at 12:30. At 1:30 Phoenix time, and whatever it is, wherever you are. So just figure it out. Try to be here a few minutes just ahead of that so we can make sure we are all starting on time. And thank you all for joining us and really participating in what turns out to be a very rewarding conversation so far. So let's thank Professor Keys and see you all in an hour.